last thing Marcus expected to be doing on the night of his sister's wedding was sneaking through the castle with his friends, descending into its shadowed and forbidden dungeons. This is a terrible idea. He glanced back at Nimrod and Carver, their expressions alive with excitement and mischief, a stark contrast to the dread pooling in his stomach. The narrow staircase of the western tower spiraled downward, each stone step colder and darker than the last. The torches mounted along the curved walls sputtered weakly, casting uneven light that barely kept the encroaching shadows at bay. At the bottom of the stairs, the familiar texture of cobblestones gave way to the uneven crunch of dirt mixed with wisps of hay and some pebbles. The air hung heavy and damp, carrying a faint metallic tang. Ahead of them, slumped against a weathered wooden door, was a guard dozing fitfully. A dented lantern beside him flickered, illuminating a set of brass keys dangling from his belt. "There's the dungeon beyond that door," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible above the faint crackle of the torchlight. "And there's our way in," Nimrod grinned, pointing to the keys. Marcus frowned. "You want me to steal those?" Nimrod nodded eagerly, suppressing a chuckle. "Absolutely not." Marcus shook his head, throwing a glance toward the sleeping guard. "You promised to show us the seer," Nimrod said, his grin faltering into an exaggerated pout. "Quiet!" Marcus hissed, pressing a finger to his lips. "I'll do it," Carver offered suddenly, his voice calm, yet amused. Both Marcus and Nimrod turned to him in surprise, but Carver only shrugged and stepped forward. His movements were deliberate, his boots making the barest whisper against the packed dirt. Marcus held his breath, his pulse thundering in his ears, as Carver crouched by the guard. Slowly, almost painfully so, Carver reached out. The keys slipped from the belt with a faint clink. Marcus winced, his heart lurching as the guard stirred, his head tilting slightly. Carver froze, his fingers hovering over the ground where the keys had fallen. Seconds stretched unbearably before the guard exhaled deeply, sinking back into his slumber. "Your father needs better guards," Nimrod muttered under his breath. Marcus shot him a withering glare before watching Carver retrieve the keys. With careful precision, Carver inserted one into the lock. The first didn't budge, nor the second. Finally, on the third try, a soft click echoed in the still air. "Success," Nimrod whispered triumphantly. Carver eased the door open, its old hinges creaking faintly. One by one, they slipped inside, closing it behind them as softly as possible. The dungeon beyond was a stark, grim world. The air felt heavier here, as if the shadows themselves pressed down on them. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, the sound echoing off cold stone walls. Cells lined both sides of the corridor, their iron bars jagged with rust. From within, figures shifted, some growling low in their throats, others retreating into the shadows. Marcus kept his gaze fixed ahead, ignoring the whispered threats and the occasional glint of feral eyes. At the very end of the corridor loomed a solitary cell, its placement deliberately isolated. 2 torches flanked the entrance, their flames casting erratic light that barely penetrated the cell's black interior. "This is it," Marcus said, his voice tinged with unease. Nimrod peered into the darkness, squinting. "I don't see anyone." "He's there," Marcus replied. Carver drew his dagger and tapped it lightly against the iron bars, the sound sharp and jarring in the oppressive silence. "Stop that!" Marcus snapped, snatching the dagger away. "You'll wake the guard." A faint rustling came from the cell, followed by a low, guttural moan. "Seth," Marcus called softly, his voice trembling. "Cold," came the reply, rasping and faint. What? Nimrod leaned closer, his brows furrowed. Speak up, seer. For a moment, silence stretched taut between them. Then, suddenly, a skeletal hand shot through the bars, its bony fingers snatching Nimrod's tunic and yanking him forward. "Let go!" Nimrod yelped, wrenching himself free and stumbling back. "Seth, it's me, Marcus," he said quickly, stepping closer to the cell. "These are my friends." From the darkness, a gaunt figure emerged. The seer's hollowed cheeks and wild beard gave him a spectral appearance, and his sunken eyes glinted with unsettling intensity. His skeletal fingers curled around the bars as he leaned forward. "Seth, do you remember me?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite his pounding heart. The seer nodded, his gaze darting between the three boys. "We have come to hear of your sight. What do you see?" Marcus pressed, though he dreaded the answer. "Cold," Seth murmured again, his voice gaining a sharp edge. "So cold." Nimrod rolled his eyes. "Fantastic. The old man's cold. Let's go." "Wait," Carver said, gesturing for silence. Seth's voice grew louder, more frenzied. "Garhana's tallest peak. Lantern fire. 10, 100, 1,000. Marcus felt his breath catch, the seer's gaze fixed on Marcus. "You," he hissed. "What do you mean?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You, Hothmore, lantern fire," the seer growled. Marcus could sink into the very ground below his feet. It was his dream. Seth described the sight of his dream. "Stop," Marcus replied, a tinge of fear lacing his voice. "Hothmore! Fire! Wind!" Seth shouted. He rattled the bars uncontrollably. "Stop! I command you to stop!" Marcus shouted back at him. "Marcus, what is wrong?" Carver asked, trying to pull him away from the bars. "He needs to stop," Marcus said louder, still locking eyes with the seer. "A hand! A hand! A hand!" Seth screeched. "Stop at once!" Marcus grew louder. He pulled Carver's dagger up and pointed it at Seth. "Marcus, no!" Carver yelled, trying to pull the dagger away from him. "The hand reaches, and the spider comes!" Seth screamed louder. Marcus lunged forward, striking Seth with the dagger. He lodged the silver blade into the seer's throat. Blood sputtered forward from the open wound around the blade, spraying onto Marcus's hands and face. Seth sunk slowly to the ground, a soft gurgling sound emitting from his mouth as he did. The boys watched in horror as the seer laid stiff on the ground, a pool of blood staining the dirt at their feet. He was dead. "Huh! Elowyn, my dear, there is something I need you to grasp about tonight," Queen Helena said, her voice laced with both tenderness and an underlying heaviness. She let out a soft sigh as her eyes followed her daughter's movements. Princess Elowyn twirled gracefully in front of an ornate-looking glass, her white nightgown flowing like water around her. The flickering candlelight gave her a radiant glow, as if she were a vision from a dream. "What do you mean?" Elowyn asked, halting mid-twirl. The joy on her face dimmed slightly as she turned to her mother, curiosity tinged with a hint of apprehension. "I want to prepare you for what this night might entail," Queen Helena said gently, her words measured. "Mother, we've had this conversation already," Elowyn replied, with a dismissive smile, brushing her hair over her shoulder, as if the topic were a formality she no longer needed to entertain. "I know," Helena conceded, her lips curving into a faint, sad smile. "But understanding doesn't always come from a single conversation, my love." "What more is there to understand before the moment arrives?" Elowyn asked, her tone growing slightly impatient. "You will lie with him," Queen Helena began, stepping closer, her voice softer still. "And as his wife, you are bound to fulfill his desires, whatever they may be. I only pray to the gods that he treats you with care." Elowin's smile returned, this time brighter and filled with the confidence of someone untouched by life's harsher truths. "Mother, the Duke is kind. I don't believe he could ever hurt me." Queen Helena moved closer, her heartache etched into every step. Standing in front of Elowin, she placed gentle hands on her daughter's cheeks, the reflection in the mirror showing a tender yet strained expression. "I pray you are right, my darling," she whispered, her fingers lingering for a moment longer before dropping away. "I pray with all my heart." Queen Helena walked hand in hand with Elowin through the dimly lit corridors, their ladies-in-waiting trailing in a hushed procession. The soft rustle of skirts and the faint clinking of jewelry filled the air as they approached Duke Saber's chambers. At the door, several solemn priests awaited them, their hands raised in prayer, invoking blessings over the young bride. Elowin stood radiant beneath a velvet burgundy cloak that concealed her flowing nightgown. She smiled softly, her cheeks tinged with a mix of nerves and excitement. When the chamber doors were opened, she gracefully slipped the cloak from her shoulders and handed it to one of her ladies, who bowed deeply before retreating. Queen Helena watched her daughter step into the room, her eyes glistening as the heavy doors swung shut. With a sigh that seemed to echo through the hall, she turned and made her way back to her own chambers for the night. Inside the Duke's chambers, the flickering candlelight cast long shadows across the sparsely furnished room. To the left stood a massive wooden bed draped in rich fabrics, and to the right, a tall bookcase loomed beside an open chest. Ahead of her, seated at an intricately carved desk, was Duke Saber. He leaned over a scroll, his quill scratching steadily as several candles illuminated his work. "Husband," Elowin said softly, her voice trembling ever so slightly as she offered a polite bow. "Just a moment," the Duke replied, without looking up, his tone calm but wearied. "I must finish this letter." Elowin nodded, her eyes wandering the room as she moved toward the bookcase. She noticed most of the books had been neatly packed away in the chest that sat beside the bookcase. She traced her fingers over the leather-bound spines, reading the titles aloud in a whisper. "The History of Cartanin, the Genealogy of Cartanin's Noble Houses, and the Great War." "Do you enjoy reading?" she asked, glancing back at him. "I do," he replied, still focused on his letter. "And you?" "I read occasionally," Elowin admitted with a smile. "Lana is the true reader in our family." The Duke paused, quill hovering mid-air, before continuing his task. "I'll have to show her my collection." "She would enjoy that," Elowin said brightly, "and there will be ample time for her to read on the voyage." "Yes," the Duke murmured, his tone distant. "She will have plenty of time." With a final flourish of his quill, he set it aside and blew gently on the parchment to dry the ink. "Who is the letter for?" Elowin asked as she approached him. Duke Saber rose from his seat, towering over her with an unreadable expression. "It's addressed to Hiltest," he said simply. "To Hiltest?" Elowin's brow furrowed. "I noticed Duke Williamson and his wife were not at the ceremony." "They were not," Saber confirmed, stepping past her to the door. He called out sharply, "Cyprian!" A brief moment passed. The door creaked open, and his captain appeared, glancing between the Duke and the young bride. Elowin, startled, darted behind one of the bed's wooden posts, peeking out cautiously. "Ensure this reaches Hiltest," Saber instructed, handing over the sealed scroll. Cyprian accepted the letter with a curt nod, before disappearing into the corridor. The Duke closed the door firmly and turned, his gaze landing on Elowin's half-hidden figure. "My apologies," he said, exhaling heavily. "I shouldn't let business intrude tonight, but it couldn't wait." "It's fine," Elowin said, stepping out from behind the post. "I understand." A faint smile touched his lips as he approached her, his movements deliberate. He reached slowly for the delicate cloth strings at her shoulders, fingers brushing lightly against her skin as he untied them. Her nightgown slipped silently to the floor, pooling around her feet. "Are you pleased, husband?" Elowin asked, her voice barely audible. The Duke's eyes travelled slowly over her before meeting her gaze. He studied her sapphire eyes intently, a quiet chuckle escaping his lips. Queen Helena dismissed her ladies-in-waiting as they approached her chambers. The women curtsied deeply before retreating, their footsteps fading into the quiet corridor. Helena slipped inside, closing the door firmly behind her and leaning against it. She shut her eyes, exhaling a long, weary sigh. "I was starting to think you wouldn't come," a familiar voice drawled, breaking the stillness. Helena's eyes flew open, her heart leaping in her chest as she scanned the room. There, leaning casually against the corner, was Jack. His dark brown eyes met hers, a mischievous glint in their depths. "What is the meaning of this?" Helena demanded, her voice sharp. She turned to reopen the door. Jack stepped forward swiftly, pressing his palm against the wood to hold it shut. "Did you really think I wouldn't find a way to see you?" Helena spun to face him, her gaze narrowing with anger. She studied the smirk, tugging at his lips. She raised her hands instinctively, pressing them against his chest. Jack's hands, in turn, slid to her waist, pulling her close. "Why didn't you write?" Helena whispered, her tone softening despite her glare. Jack sighed, his expression momentarily regretful. "You know why, Helena. Time is never on my side." She let out a breath, her resolve crumbling as she leaned into him, pressing her lips to his in a fervent kiss. Jack backed her against the door, his hands tangling in her hair as the passion between them deepened. "Knock, knock!" Helena's eyes flew open, her body tensing as the sound echoed through the room. Jack froze. "My queen, it is the king's squire," a nervous voice called from beyond the door. "I bring a message for you." Helena cleared her throat, forcing composure. "Just a moment," she called, her voice steady, despite the panic bubbling inside her. Jack glanced around the room, his expression turning grim as he searched for a hiding spot. Helena gestured toward the large chest at the foot of her bed. "Not there," Jack hissed. Helena lifted the lid, her tone urgent. "Get in, now." With a roll of his eyes, Jack crouched and climbed into the cramped chest. Helena eased the lid shut, securing it with a metallic click of the latch. "Enter," she called to the squire, stepping away from the chest with forced calm. The door opened to reveal a young man, his face flushed with nerves as he bowed. "What is this message?" Helena asked impatiently, her tone sharper than intended. "The king requests your presence in his chambers tonight, your grace," the squire said, his voice timid. Helena's lips parted in surprise. "At this hour? It's much too late. Tell him I cannot come." The squire shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting to the floor. "He insisted, your grace. He said I must not return without you." Helena exhaled through gritted teeth, frustration flashing across her face. "My ladies have already retired. How am I to go to him alone?" The young man hesitated, his unease palpable. "The king was firm in his request, your grace." Helena stood silent for a moment, her fingers tightening at her sides. Finally, she let out a resigned sigh. "Very well." She stepped into the corridor, casting a lingering glance back at the chest near her bed. Her stomach twisted with regret as the squire closed the door behind her. "Let us go," she said. The squire pushed open the heavy door to the king's chambers, stepping aside to allow Queen Helena to enter. With a quick bow, he retreated, the door clicking shut behind her. Helena moved into the dimly lit room, her eyes adjusting to the flickering light from the fire burning in the hearth against the far wall. King Henry sat in a high-backed chair before the flames, his gaze fixed intently on the dancing embers. "You summoned me," Helena said, her tone sharp with a mix of fatigue and irritation. "I did," Henry replied without turning. "Henry, it's late, and you know this day has been taxing," she said, crossing her arms as she took a step closer. Still, he remained silent. Helena let out an exasperated sigh. "Let's not drag this out. What do you want?" Henry finally turned his head, his eyes meeting hers. "That's not why I called you here." Helena's hands froze mid-motion, poised to loosen her gown. Her brows knit together as she studied him. "Then why am I here? What has happened?" "Sit with me by the fire," Henry said, gesturing to the empty chair beside him. Without hesitation, Helena strode forward, lowering herself into the chair. She kept her gaze locked on his face, searching for any clue about his mood or intent. "Helena," Henry began, his voice heavy, "why didn't you tell me that Jack arrived last night?" Helena leaned back in the chair, exhaling sharply. "It was late, Henry. I barely had time to gather myself." "You should have told me," he said, his tone firm but not raised. "You knew how critical today was, and I needed to be prepared. You are my greatest ally, Helena. I rely on you." "Your greatest ally?" she shot back, her voice tinged with frustration. "You seem disinclined to listen to my counsel during the celebrations." Henry's jaw tightened, but he didn't rise to the bait. "That doesn't matter now. What matters is that you don't keep such things from me again." Helena held his gaze for a moment longer, before nodding slowly. "I'm sorry." The crackling fire filled the silence that settled between them, the tension in the room palpable. "Is that all, then?" Helena asked, beginning to rise from her chair. "I'm afraid not," Henry said, his voice somber. She paused, her eyes narrowing. "What is it, Henry? What's wrong?" Henry leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as his breathing slowed, the weight of his words visibly pressing down on him. "Something happened in the dungeons tonight," he said quietly. Helena straightened, her expression hardening. "What happened?" Henry looked down at his hands, then back at her, his face lined with grief. "Seth was killed."